My name is Barbara Doyle, and I'm a special education professional, and I have been for over 45 years. I'm also a family member of both children and adults with disabilities. Today we want to talk about safety skills. Safety skills are very important for lifetime success. Unsafe people have more limited lives. Unsafe people have less positive outcomes than people who use only safe behavior. We need to begin to identify and teach safe ways of interacting and behaving beginning at a very early age. This video explores the importance of safety skills. We'll learn what safety skills are most important to teach. And let's explore ways to prioritize safety skills at home, in programs, and in the community. Why are safety skills so important? Because unsafe people have limited lives. If you're not safe, people aren't going to want to have you at the movies. They might not want to invite you to a party. You might not get to ride the bus or use public transportation. Unsafe people have less access to all of the wonderful environments in our society. They need much more expensive and intrusive supports. When children have unsafe behaviors, we have to spend a lot more money and a lot more time just trying to get them not to be dangerous. Unsafe children have less participation and less satisfaction in their lives. People may not want to be around them. The other children may not want to play with them if they're afraid that this child will hit them or throw something or do something else that's potentially harmful. Unsafe people don't belong to groups as well as safe people do. So being unsafe can cause you to have an isolated life where other people just don't want to be around you, and so you're alone most of the time. And very unfortunately, if you're an unsafe child or adult, as you grow older, the outcomes can be even worse. Unsafe people can end up in jail, institutionalized, chronically depressed, chronically isolated, or dead. That's how important it is for us to address unsafe behaviors. We don't want those kinds of outcomes for our children. So at the earliest possible age, starting today, we want to eliminate behaviors that are a danger to the child themselves or when the child endangers others. We want to eliminate behaviors that could be misinterpreted as criminal later on as they get a little older. And we want to eliminate behaviors that could cause the person to be victimized. We also want to identify potentially dangerous behavior, behavior that isn't harmful now but could be in the future. An example might be of a little 3-year-old who pushes people, and maybe they push the person in the legs and the person doesn't fall or anything because they're only 3 years old. But what if they push somebody who's standing at the top of a flight of concrete steps and that person falls and is harmed? Now that child would be viewed as a danger to society. So we want to look at behavior that could become dangerous and address it right away. We also want to address the behaviors that we now control. So say, for example, there's a little child that runs away if you let go of their hand. And so we control that by always holding their hand. Or perhaps there's a child who runs out the front door without permission into an unsafe environment. And we take care of that by locking the door or having someone stop them. Those are potentially dangerous situations that we now control. But what if those controls weren't present? So those behaviors also become very high on our list of behaviors to change. I like to think about behavior in 4 categories so we can determine what's most important to address first and prioritize in that way. Conventional behavior is behavior that's pretty much what everybody does, and it's not a problem to anyone, and it looks pretty much like everybody else looks. Unconventional behavior is not exactly what everyone else does, but it's not really a problem. So if a child likes to wear his pants pulled up high, or if he likes to have his sandwich cut in a certain way that's different from other people's, that may be unconventional, but it's really not problematic. What we want to do with unconventional behavior is just explain it to other people, especially explain it to the child's peers. Oh, Randy likes to eat his sandwich like that. Once unconventional behavior is explained, we usually don't have to do anything about it or spend much time on it. An unconventional behavior might be not saying please and thank you. Sometimes people get very involved in teaching please and thank you, when really there's a lot of people who don't use it and it's just a little unconventional. It's not dangerous in any way. Another kind of behavior that's important to think about is called stigmatizing behavior. Stigmatizing behavior is behavior that someone does that makes you not want to be around them or makes them not able to be in a certain environment. So if you go to a movie and it's not a scary movie and you're screaming during the movie, that's going to be stigmatizing. Pretty soon people are going to say, get that child out of here, don't let that person in the movie theater, we don't want to be around that person. Or if a child or adult is at a buffet and they serve themselves with their hands instead of the utensils, that may not be technically dangerous, but it's certainly stigmatizing. People are going to say, I don't want that person here. The same is true of when it's time to get in line, of not knowing how to get at the end of the line, which, by the way, turns out to be more important than learning how to line up in a straight line. So those are behaviors we really want to address. Stigmatizing behaviors will cause the child to have places where people don't want them to be, and we want them to be able to be everywhere in the world they want to be. And then the fourth category is dangerous and potentially dangerous behavior. Now, this category is the most important category to identify and address. And I want you to remember that when you're addressing dangerous behavior, we're eliminating it. We're not just saying, oh, let's control it. We have to control it if it's dangerous at the time. But our real goal is that this child replaces that behavior with a variety of other behaviors that are not dangerous. Well, I have a couple of rules to think about when you think about dangerous behavior and safety. Rule number one is, be careful what you teach because somebody might learn it. I know that sounds like a funny rule, but let me give you an example of a young boy who was taught to shake hands with people when he met them. That was cute and fun when he was 4 years old and shook hands with the principal and his grandmother. But by the time he got to high school and change of class, that behavior caused him to be viewed as unsafe to change class at the same time as all the other students. He wanted to shake the hand of every student that he went past. Well, he couldn't do that. So he was forced to not do change of class with the other high school students. Things got even worse as an adult. He became a great big man, and remember, all our cute little kids are going to grow up to be big people. As a big man, he would go into a grocery store and try to grab everybody's hands and shake them. Well, people felt assaulted. They felt attacked. They didn't know he was a person with a disability, and even when it was explained to them, their hands still hurt, they were still afraid of him. And he was excluded from many, many places. Now, even though he lives in a small, customized home, he cannot go into the community unless there's 2 men with him to take him, to make him not shake the hands of the people he encounters. So be careful what you teach, and think now, if I teach this to this child now, will it be okay when they're 30? And if it's not going to be okay when they're an adult, then don't teach that skill right now. Teach something else that will endure across time. Now, my second rule is, what's cute at 2 can be limiting at 13, dangerous at 23, and cause the person to be victimized. For example, a little boy walking out of the bathroom, he's just used the toilet, and he still has his pants around his feet. He comes out of the bathroom, and everybody laughs, and it's kind of funny. Well, if he does that in the bathroom at middle school, he will be considered extremely inappropriate and may even be removed from the school. If he does that when he's an adult in the bathroom at the mall, he could be sexually victimized by predators who will recognize that he doesn't know anything about what he needs to know to be a safe person. So think about the behaviors your children are using now that you think are cute or funny, and decide, will this be cute or funny when he's a teenager, when she's an adult? Will this be cute or funny when he or she goes to college? Because remember, we don't know who's going to college. A lot of our kids end up going to college or going somewhere to a camp. We don't want them to be excluded because we didn't address these kinds of behaviors early enough. And then rule number 3 is, it's more important what you do than what you know. A lot of educational programs focus on what children know. Do they know this set of facts? Do they know their math? Do they know their state capitals? Do they know how to write their name? But just using those few examples, you can see those, you could live your whole life without those. You could live your whole life and not know your state capitals. But if you go into somebody's house when they're not home, that could be misinterpreted as a criminal act. So certain behavior becomes much more important for us to address because what people do will turn out to be more important than what they know. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Which of these are more important? Is it more important that a child learn how to complete the task you've put in front of them, or that she learns a safe way to get out of it? Without throwing it, without hitting anyone, without causing any danger. Which is more important? Is it more important that a child always do what he's told, or that he has a safe way to demonstrate that he can't do that right now, or even that he won't do that right now? Which is more important? Always doing what everyone says, or having a safe way not to do it? And then what's more important? Using a complete sentence to make a request, or closing the bathroom door when you're using the toilet? I think it's pretty clear that we know what's more important now that we're starting to think about this way. So to change behavior and create safer children, what can we do? Well, the first thing is to identify the function of dangerous behavior. By function, I mean, why is the child resorting to dangerous behavior? Why does he hit his sister? Why does he run out in front of traffic? Why does she throw things? We need to not default to saying it's because she's spoiled, or he's stubborn, or he's non-compliant, or he wants attention. Sometimes we say that's the reason why, or he wants to avoid a task. That's an oversimplified way of looking at things from my point of view. From my point of view, children with disabilities are always making sense. I had a young student who pushed people all the time. Well, when we identified the why, the function behind that, we discovered it was because he didn't know how to tell people to get out of his way. And so he would push them. Well, we taught him the sign for move, which looks like this, move. And we taught the other children that when he signed move, move. Well, he stopped pushing the other children, and it didn't take very long at all. Another thing that we can do to change behavior and create safer children is give more control to the child. We don't need to control absolutely everything that the child does. Are there times that the child can pick the place where they want to sit in the room, what they want to eat first, what clothes they want to wear? People who have more control tend to be calmer people. Children who are allowed to have control over various aspects of their lives usually deal better with the aspect of their lives when they don't have the right to control it. So giving more control and choice to very young children with special needs really does help them stay calm and helps them cope when they can't have that control. Another way to change behavior that could be dangerous or problematic or potentially dangerous is to teach more than one skill to replace the dangerous behavior. So maybe if the child hits others, we might decide there were multiple reasons for that. And so maybe we will teach that child gestures to tell people to back up. Or maybe we'll teach that child to hold his hand out when he wants the toy the other child is playing with, rather than hit the child who has the toy. Sometimes we need to teach people how to say stop, and meaning the child stops us. Sometimes we have to tell them how to tell us when they need a break, or when they want us to stop talking, or when they're angry. We need to teach them safe ways to be angry, such as slapping a table when you're angry instead of hitting somebody else. So if we want to address the problem of hitting others, we may have to replace that dangerous behavior with 5 or 6 other skills. Wouldn't this be a great way to focus the IEP? Or wouldn't this be a great way to focus the family service plan? To help children be safer and use safe behavior, we need to teach them more communication skills. Now, some of our children cannot speak, and so in communication skills, I'm not just referring to what they should say. Perhaps we're going to use pictures or word cards or a voice output device so that the child can send messages to others. Remember that part of being safe is about sending messages to others about what they need to do on your behalf right now. To change the behavior of children, it's important to understand the function of motivation. Motivation actually changes the way our brains work. As long as the child makes the connection between using the right behavior, the aspects of motivation in the brain will work, and you will find that kids are much more focused. Now, something else to keep people safe and address changing problematic behavior or dangerous behavior is to use an objective description of the behavior. Sometimes we're very subjective. Sometimes we say, well, she did that because she's stubborn, or she did that because she's spoiled, or she did that because her mother lets her do that. None of those things are true. Certainly it's not the parent's fault. When somebody has a dangerous behavior, they need our help to help their child change that. But we want to use words that are not subjective. If someone hits someone, we don't want to say he attacked her violently. We want to say he held his hand with the palm open 5 inches from her arm and then hit her and it did not leave a red mark, for example. That's an objective description of behavior. We want to take the emotion-packed words out of the description of the behavior so we can find out what's really happening here and then how can we really make effective changes. In order to be safe, all of our children have to know the real name of every body part. Start this training as early as possible. Don't call parts of their body down here or your bottom. Call them the exact medical names. If you aren't sure what those are, just look them up. We want people to be able to tell us if somebody touches them in a certain part of their body. We want them to be able to tell us if they're having pain or an issue in certain parts of their bodies. So they must actually know the name of everything that's part of their body and the bodies of people of the opposite sex. We also need to teach the child using all kinds of skills that the child has, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, use of pictures, voice output, drawings, whatever works for the child, that's what we're going to use to teach them how to use safe behavior. Now here's a couple of cautions for you. When people are upset, we sometimes call that dysregulated or out of control or very upset. When somebody's already in an upset frame of mind, they can't learn anything right that moment. You cannot teach an upset child, and you should not try to consequence an upset child or tell them what's going to happen to them because they did the wrong thing. If there's no imminent danger to human beings, don't touch children when they're already upset or dysregulated. Be nearby so you can help them in any way that they need. Protect them from harming themselves or others, but otherwise don't grab children when they're upset. Sometimes just putting your hand on their shoulder when they're upset to be reassuring turns out to make them even more upset because it gives them more stimulus that they have to deal with. Another thing we want to do on a regular basis is create calming strategies for the child to do when they're beginning to become upset. This is a prevention method. If we can teach children how to be calm more of the time and not be upset, a lot of the dangerous behavior will never happen at all. But remember, you can't teach somebody to be calm once they're already upset. You have to develop calming strategies and practice them every day when nobody's upset. That way, when the child's upset, you can begin using the calming strategy and they will automatically begin to calm down. It's really important for people to learn to calm themselves down if they're going to be a safe person in our society and world. It's so important for all of us to be able to calm ourselves down. And it's important for children to learn to calm themselves down and not always have to be calmed down by what everybody else does. There was a young man who was a cartoonist, and he was a person with disabilities, but he had great ability in cartooning, and he was hired by a major newspaper to do cartoons for them. But he lost that job. Even though he had all the skills needed for the job, once he would become upset, he would have to talk to 2 people for over an hour before he could calm himself down. Well, that's not acceptable in the world of work and in society in general. So even when our children are very little, we want to teach them self-calming strategies. It might be to get in the rocking chair and wrap up in a blanket. It might be to sing a favorite song or count backwards or read a poem or pick up a book or an activity. But we have to teach children ways to calm themselves down as early as possible while we protect them from harming themselves or others while they're upset.
Teachers and families often struggle with how to change unsafe behavior. Let's hear from Cynthia, a preschool teacher at the Summit School, on ways she has provided an environment where children can use calming strategies.
We have an at-risk population, so a lot of those kids, and frankly any kid on any given day, might have a lot of wiggles and just have a lot of energy. Maybe the weather hasn't been that great, they haven't had a chance to go outside. So we have this area for them to go and kind of do some self-calming. Children can't really learn if they're so revved up, their bodies are so agitated that they can't focus their brain. So we do that brain-body connection. If we can get their body to expend some of that energy, then they're much more able to sit and focus and pay attention to what's going on around them. So in that room, we have a hanging bar, we have a scooter that's got a cord that they can pull on, we've got bolsters. I love the bolster. The kids can hang on the bolster, put their arms down, and do the wheelbarrow. Gets great input into their joints, so you get that whole body awareness thing. We also have a great, it's a giant rolling pin, and it's good because they get the input all over their body, so they can lie on their tummies, and we can roll them out, and then they can lie on their back, so we can roll out their arms and legs. And they think it's great. We tell them that we're making pizza, we're making bread dough, and they get to be, they get to pretend, and it's really wonderful. So they get that input, they get to expend that energy in a positive way. One of the things that I really like to do is just take a deep breath. Well, I didn't realize that when I go, that the kids were copying the motion as well, and that's also a yoga move, and I did. So the kids now, if I tell everyone, okay, let's take a deep breath, they all do the whole thing. So they're getting the deep breath, they're getting the movement, and it's great, they get centered. Everybody stops talking for a moment, and I have their attention.
Here's some other important goals that we could work on when prioritizing safety. Don't give your money to the first person who asks. I always like to give children a wallet with a little bit of money in it in their backpack, and then teach other people, like the adults, to ask them for that money and teach the child to say, no, that's my money. That's a way to keep them from being victimized by others. And don't buy something from somebody who wants your money before you see what you're buying. Don't go into somebody's house uninvited, even if they're really good friends and even if you're normally welcome there. There are some skills that are necessary to be safe medically. For example, we need to teach children from a very early age to inhale through their nose and exhale through their mouth when the doctor has the stethoscope on their back. In this way, we can find situations like early pneumonia much earlier. So that's a great thing to teach your children to do, to inhale and exhale through their mouth. We also need to teach children to allow their temperature to be taken with a standard thermometer, not a digital one, because sometimes doctors will want to take their temperature that way. We need to teach them to allow us to look in their eyes, to look in their ears, to look in their noses, and to look in their mouths. These are all medical safety skills. Now that we know how important safety skills are, we can prioritize them. We can work on them, we can replace dangerous behavior with safe behavior, and we can create the best possible outcomes for all of our children.